change at which the world is evolving, and the Urban Living Festival is now so more relevant than ever as we look to define the future of hospitality and real estate.
Urban Living Festival came about really based around a lot of different hospitality and real estate asset classes all converging really at the same time. You've got co-work, co-live, PRS, built to rent, student housing.
As editor of short-term rentals, I'm delighted to be welcoming hospitality and real estate leaders from across the world to Urban Living Festival in London, our inaugural event on the 25th and 26th of November 2020 at Tobacco Dock.
So the big idea really was ultimately quite simple, to bring everybody together. So I'm really looking forward to attracting, I'd say, real estate and hospitality urban innovators to explore what I suppose urban living actually is.
The pandemic is not going to stop the pace of urbanisation. If you look over my shoulder here, you can see we're in London today. It's late August. The building sites are busy, the cranes are moving.
It's a thought leadership forum as much as it is a forum for business. I know I'm going to learn a lot, and I'm going to learn a lot about everybody that plays in it. Providers, suppliers, tech, accounting services, all of the pieces that you need to make your business successful. I'll learn a lot there.
However far technology moves along, people will always have the need to come together, to socialise, to work and collaborate together, to be hospitable, and basically to be social animals.
The whole event will reflect the resilience and resolve we've seen across the asset classes as they continue to evolve. And on top of that, we're going to be in conversation with all of the major urban trendsetters and innovators as we look to navigate these uncertain times.
Okay, good afternoon everybody, or good evening or good morning, depending on whichever part of the world you're in, and welcome to the latest in the Urban Living webinar series. If you are not one of our select panel of speakers, if you could just keep your camera off and your microphone on mute, that would be great. That will avoid any unwanted interference and disturbances to the sound. Today's session has been kindly sponsored by Comscope. We'll hear from them shortly. Today we're going to discuss branded residences and how they are shaking up urban living. So this is the latest in a series of webinars which are a precursor to a new event that we're launching in November this year at Tobacco Dock in London called the Urban Living Festival. And it will focus on how the various hospitality and real estate asset classes are converging. There's some exciting stuff going on. And this event is going to reflect that, and we're really looking forward to doing some face-to-face meetings and business with people. It's been a long time since we've been able to do that, and it's going to be a great opportunity. And for a limited time only, we are offering 40% off tickets to the event, so don't miss out the chance. Go to the website and use the code ULF40. Just a bit of housekeeping about today's session. As I said, if you could keep yourself muted and keep your camera off, that would be great. There'll be a recording of the session sent out via email by the end of the week to everybody who has registered. We're going to have around 40 to 45 minutes of discussion with the panel, and then there will be Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, please use the chat function in Zoom, and we'll try to get through as many of those as we can towards the end. My name's George Sell. I'm Editor-in-Chief at International Hospitality Media, We are a B2B online publisher and events organizer for the hospitality industry. We've got a great panel of speakers with us today, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves shortly. But before then, I just wanted to give a bit of background and context to the conversation that we're going to have today. So the branded residence sector remains dominated by hotel brands. 86% of all schemes are hotel branded, but it's not exclusively hotel brands. We've had fashion brands such as Armani and Lagerfeld, and even car manufacturers, Aston Martin, Porsche, Mercedes too, I think, have all lent their names to branded residence projects. Thomas Zabel from JLL says a branded residence instills a higher level of confidence among users and buyers than an unbranded property, whether they're planning on living in it themselves or renting it out. With a well-known hotel brand such as Marriott or Hilton, customers know that they're going to get the same quality product all over the world. This equally translates into higher resale values for buyers. The combination of hotel and residential creates synergies rather than conflicts of use, he says. The local developer has much to learn from the extensive experience of global hotel operators to create the premium product that high-end buyers want. Equally, hotel operators need the local expertise. In the future, we'll see partnerships becoming more common and more comprehensive. How the mechanics of this usually work has been outlined here by Alexandros Moulas from Savills. Said with mixed-use branded projects, companies license their brands to developers in return for fees. Royalty fees range between 1% and 6%, with non-hotel brands typically charging between 1% and 2.5%, and hotel brands between 2.5% and 6%. Over 50% of new resort projects taken to the hotel brands now have a branded residential component. So that's from Muriel at WATG. So this is a growing phenomenon, and I don't think the momentum is likely to slow down anytime soon. So here's a slide from WATG, who've done a white paper actually called the Branded Residence Atlas, which is worth downloading. I think, yeah, the link to that is in the chat there. So you can see that of the existing supply, the large majority of it is in North America, with Asia Pacific being the second largest market. But the supply pipeline is much more evenly distributed. Asia Pacific, just the largest, closely followed by Latin America, and then North America. And in terms of pipeline size, Marriott at number 1, closely followed by Accor, who we have represented on the call today, followed by 4 Seasons Hyatt. So you can see all this information and more on the WATG paper. So before our contributors introduce themselves, our sponsor for today, Juan from CommScope, is just going to talk to us for a word or two. Over to you, Juan.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm delighted to be sponsoring this topic. Just a brief introduction to CommScope, and let you get on with a discussion, which is an important thing today. CommScope is an $11 billion company looking at networks, and by networks we mean your core infrastructure, your Wi-Fi, your switching, your IoT element, and your indoor mobile coverage. And we bring all that into the hospitality, the student accommodation world, the build to rent world, the senior living world, everything basically where there's a bed. So we have a focused team worldwide focused on this sector. It is strategic for us, and it is very challenging for us and for you, as guest expectations and residents' expectations change so quickly. So we try and ensure long-term return on investment and peace of mind working with our partners. And then I will hand you over to the discussion.
Great, thank you, Juan. Thanks for that. So let's ask our panelists to introduce themselves, please. I'd like you to go from left to right as I can see you in my gallery. So Felicity, would you like to go first?
I see her on a column, so it's a bit different. I'm head of the global real estate practice for Watson, Farley and Williams. I specialise in the hotels, leisure and generally operating assets. So operating real estate assets ranging through the whole service department, co-living, senior living, care homes, the whole gamut. And I'm a corporate lawyer, so that's slightly different. I'm quite focused on the branding and the actual agreements with the brands. And I tend to act mainly for owners, but occasionally I'll act for some of the owning brands like Fraser's and a couple of others that I act for that probably I feel have more sympathy or empathy with an owner than possibly some of the larger brands. But I hope Jeff will challenge me on that one.
Thanks, Felicity. Thea, over to you.
Sure. So Thea Ross, Managing Director of Strategic Hotel Consulting. I'm based in Zurich, in Switzerland, and we are working quite a lot with branded residencies. So we've covered branded residencies from Asia, Middle East, Europe, and I think even a few projects in Africa. So it's a very sort of common topic for us and seems to be getting more and more popular by the year. In general, we work with owners, operators, investors, and try to help them to make good investments. Thanks,
Thea. And finally, Jeff, over to you.
Many thanks, George. Appreciate the opportunity to join everyone this morning. Thanks, of course, also to CommScope and Urban Living. I'm the SVP of Development at Accor for residential and extended stay. And so I lead a team with specialists in each of our regions globally that work very, very closely with our development partners on extended stay and in particular on branded residential projects. It's a space that we're very, very active in. Over the last 5 years, we've taken our branded residential platform and we've really extended it across all the segments, starting in mid-scale to a certain extent, but really accelerating as we get into the premium segments, the luxury segments, ultra luxury with brands like Orient Express and Raffles, and then increasingly really in the lifestyle segments with brands like Mondrian, SLS, and Hyde.
Great, thanks, Jeff. And Jeff is in Singapore, so it's quite late at night for him. So not only do we have an international panel, we're scanning the time zones too. All the LinkedIn profiles of our contributors are in the chat, along with Juan from CommScope too, and I think a link to CommScope's website. So if you'd like to get in touch with any of them, I'm sure they'd be pleased to hear from you. So let's kick off by trying to define what a branded residence is, because I think it has slightly different and nuanced interpretations depending on who you talk to and where in the world you are. So Jeff, would you like to start on that one? What does a branded residence mean to you?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, George. I think with the concept, it's important to keep it, simple. Ultimately, at the end of the day, a branded residence is, from a consumer perspective, is a private home. It could be a villa, a chalet, a luxury apartment. But the critical distinction is that it's developed, it's licensed to be developed, marketed, sold, and in many instances operated to the specifications of a third-party brand. So again, in our case, that would be to the specifications of Raffles or Pullman or Swiss Hotel. In many instances, particularly with the hospitality codes, they're co-located with hotels, but increasingly, I think across the industry, it's fair to say that we're seeing branded residences that are standalone. We're seeing branded residences that are co-located. It's a concept really that began in the Americas, but over the last 10 to 12 years, we've really seen the globalization of the concept. There's been a real sort of proof of concept in ultra prime markets in virtually every continent in the world. So it's a concept I think that's got a lot of momentum. But at the end of the day, what we're really focused on is creating an enhanced living product that enables private ownership in chalets, in villas, and in apartments that again are marketed, sold, designed, and operated to a specific third-party brand specification.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Thea, what's your take on the product?
Yeah, I love branded residencies. I think it's something that it's worked really well over the past sort of decade and a bit more. I think the only thing I'd say about branded residencies is that it's one of those things that if everybody's going into it knowing exactly what they are going into it, it works extremely well. So it can work for the developer, it works for the operator, it works for the private individual who then owns the residence. Where the challenges with this model come is that if it is not understood right from the beginning what it is actually that they are going into. So like everything in life, it's about managing expectations, and some of the sort of common things where things can start to go a little bit sideways is if you have sort of developers who view the branded residencies that it's going to come and finance their whole hotel, or if you have the individual owners who think that it's a sort of a investment where they're going to make double-digit returns. That's usually when things go wrong. So if everybody understands what's the purpose for why you have the branded residence, if the contracts are done very, very carefully, that's another key thing. So there's a lot of legal framework that goes around branded residencies, and that needs to be addressed right from the beginning of the project. If that's done correctly, and the expectations of the individual owners are managed well in the sense that it is a lifestyle investment. And yes, you might cover some of your costs or make a small return, but probably for pure returns, you find better places, then it works really well. And we have a lot of exceptional examples in many different corners of the world where it really has been a very successful model.
Thanks, Taya. Felicity, in your experience, do the various parties involved have this clear understanding that Taya says is ideal, or is it not always as clear cut as it should be?
It is quite difficult, but Taya's absolutely right. You have got to cover as much detail as you possibly can at the beginning, because first, I think the expectations reduce slightly that the residences all be sold in advance to pay for the hotel, because that came slightly adrift a while ago. But unless you, for example, when you're building the hotel, are you going to let all the residences use the same resources? So that's where the brands have a significant input, and their expertise is vital, because they will know whether they need to restrict the use of some of the residences. The last thing you want are 10 party houses that are rented out separately. So there needs to be some very clear governance. There needs to be some idea of how it will operate, and also to cover what will happen if a brand does decide to leave, if it's connected to a hotel and the brand's no longer operating that hotel. Where's this going to go to? And it's important for the buyers of the real estate to understand what it is they're signing up to, because the breakdown of what percentage they get at the end, even if their unit is let most of the time, the breakdown of the percentage they get after the provision for the FF&E and things of that nature is something that needs to be very clear.
Yeah, okay, thanks Felicity. Obviously the choice of brand in any project is absolutely crucial. So Jeff, you've got a number of brands at your disposal. When a developer comes to you with a project, do they normally have one of your brands in mind, or do they come in with an open mind and you look at the project and try and help them decide which one would be the best fit?
Very good question, George. And, certainly we see both of those scenarios play out. I think in our situation, we're fortunate. We operate, 40 plus brands around the world, again, covering a number of segments. I think what is very important, and our partner may very well approach us with a strong brand preference, but there's always, I think, value in both parties sort of stepping back. I think the decision on what is the right brand to go with is best looked at through both the lens, particularly if it's co-located with a hotel, through the lens of both what's best for the hotel. So, from a hotel segmentation perspective, is there a segment within the relevant hospitality market or hotel market that's underserved? What brand is going to be successful? Is it a premium brand? Is it a lifestyle brand, luxury, ultra luxury? And then similarly, what is also true of our partners is even when they have a preference with respect to a specific brand or a specific segment, they typically come with an idea in terms of, in residential terms, what is the market they're targeting? Who's the customer that they're targeting? What are the psychographics of that buyer? What are the demographics of the buyer? What are the key source markets? And so the key really is looking at it first through the lens of the hotel, and then secondly through the lens of the residential market and what the market demands, is really to find that brand that's going to deliver both from a hotel investment perspective, but equally as importantly, obviously from a branded residential perspective. And a lot of times those source markets on the residential side prove to be very, very important. If that brand has a particularly strong footprint in key overseas source markets, that might be the tipping point that makes, you know, a choice like Raffles, if the target market is in Asia where the Raffles brand is incredibly strong, that might be the tipping point that makes Raffles the right solution both for the hotel component and the residential component. But it really is a two-pronged approach, and it requires expertise both on the development partner side and obviously on the operator side to be able to evaluate both of those options.
Thanks, Jeff. We're seeing the growth of dual and even triple branded projects. Is that something that your residences brands are playing a part in?
Yeah, absolutely. More so on, quite frankly, on the extended stay side, it would be very common, for instance, to see a brand like Adagio dual branded with a brand like Pullman on the hotel side. On the branded residential side, you're much more likely to see alignment between the hotel brand and the residential brand. Now, where you might see triple branded projects would be, perhaps a premium branded project co-located with a luxury or ultra luxury branded project, and it would be probably more common to see the residential branding aligned with the brand of the luxe or the ultra luxury project, depending again on the strategy and the target for the residential project. The reason though that you generally see strong alignment between the residential branding and the hotel branding is, as you can imagine, for at least for the hospitality brands, the brands that we're typically licensing and managing on behalf of our partners, one of the brand promises is to bring that brand to life in the operating process. Certainly the design, the architecture needs to evoke the DNA and the feeling of brand, but equally importantly, we've got to deliver in the operating phase. And clearly that's a lot easier to do when you've got the engine of the hotel, all the services to leverage off of, all the training and the internalization of the brand that occurs within the hotel. It makes it significantly easier to pull off and deliver on that promise, particularly as you move into the luxe and ultra luxe segments. So we are certainly seeing an increase in dual and triple branded projects, but I think the one caveat is you would continue to expect to see strong alignment between the residences and at least one of those brands.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Taya, let's talk for a minute about the buyer who's actually purchasing these units and whether the buyer profile changes from one market to another. So obviously you've mentioned one group, which are retail investors, if you like to call them, people who are buying individual units, putting them into a rental pool, perhaps using a few weeks themselves. Are there also people who are buying big tranches of apartments, maybe whole buildings? And does the purchaser actually ever buy them as their primary residence? Is there a broad mix of buyers?
Yeah, so there is a broad mix of buyers, and I'd say that with branded residences, it's usually the destination first which drives those decisions. So if you are looking at some of the very leisure-driven locations, so for example, Indian Ocean, in the Seychelles, there's now a few in Maldives, Thailand, these are very clearly, I wouldn't even say it's a second home, it's probably third or fourth or fifth home. So we are talking of really high net worth individuals who have several houses in different locations, and that's a clear lifestyle investment. So they like to be going for a holiday in these destinations, maybe once a year, several weeks, and then the rest of the time. It's quite interesting that even when you have the rental pool on a voluntary basis, even with many of the very high-end sort of luxury properties, actually a lot of the buyers still want to give it to the rental pool. So, so the view they take is that they use it for the time they are there. It's clearly for the sort of holiday purpose, and then the rest of the time it's with the hotel. They hope to make a little bit of return back from it. Very personal decisions, these sort of more vacation-oriented places. We're doing a few in Switzerland in the mountains, absolutely same sort of experience. So you're looking at people who like mountains, like skiing, and they want to have a place in a nice branded place in Switzerland. When you look at the city properties, it can be, not always, but it can be a totally different mix. So I take an example from Dubai, where the branded residences have become sort of very popular over the past 10 years, and there were some phenomenal success stories there. Actually, in Dubai, oftentimes the story has gone more in the way that the users have requested as little days as possible for their personal use. So in other words, they purely look at it as an investment piece. And many of them, they didn't use it at all for their own personal use, but then the expectation is different. So they are looking at sort of well north of 5 or even in double digits, and that's difficult to achieve. So, so there's a little bit of pressure on these markets where the buyer has been primarily dominated by the investment returns. And then, like you said, you have these cases where the buyer behaves almost like an institutional investor. So you might be someone sitting in Asia, you see a nice development coming up somewhere in Europe, and you just look at it a place where to park money. So you might buy 10, 20 units of something, if you are allowed, because there's also legal restrictions around that, how many you can own in some places. But if you can, some have also used it just as a place to basically park equity.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Dubai. Obviously, they have recently announced that they're going to be introducing shared title deeds for units there. Do you think that's a development which could tie up nicely with branded residences? Will the two go together well?
It could, if it's done well. So again, it goes back to this whole framework. As long as you've got the legal framework sorted out, it can work really well. So it's a little bit like some of the operators, they have experimented this idea of having a fractional ownership. So it may be a place in I think there were a few, for example, in China, with a few of the luxury brands, where you can basically buy a part of a banyan tree. So you might own a 1/12 of a banyan tree, which is located in Lijiang or somewhere else. And I think as long as the legal framework is done well, it can work. There is a lot more risk with that structure, because already with just one owner, going back to Felicity's point about, for example, who can use the facilities and what's the restrictions, already on those there are challenges. And then when you add multiple owners per unit, basically you multiply the potential problems.
Yeah, I'm guessing fractional ownership is not something you might be advising your clients to adopt.
I gotta say, at this very moment, we are not working on fractional ownership program. Not to say it couldn't work. I think it's also dependent on the locations where you've got your residencies. But I'd say that if we were working, I'd be sure we have a top lawyer on board.
Yeah.
Yes.
Felicity, are there any other legal considerations that owners need to and developers need to be taking on board when thinking about a project like this?
Well, each is coming from a very different point of view. It's interesting. I've come across one particular development where they started with the enthusiasm, but they hadn't sorted out their branding first, which led to quite a lot of problems, because they were very good at developing the residential units. They could build the hotel, but actually quite how everything was going to interact hadn't really been properly thought about. So whilst in many circumstances, I will urge caution when discussing with a brand, and indeed in these circumstances, but this is an area where a brand can be vital to a project, or at least to getting it right, particularly if you're going to attract the sort of investment that you're seeking. And it's quite interesting that the Four Seasons in Athens, for example, I believe they sold incredibly quickly at incredibly high costs, but Four Seasons have been in that market for a long time. Which must give confidence to the way in which they operate. Some operators, I think, are less well versed in it. Not Jeff's brands, but there are some brands that you almost feel they're coming new to it, and then that can be quite difficult. So whilst it shouldn't always be the established brands, I think on pure branded residences, that's where the comfort's going to be, whether it's a Fairmont or a Four Seasons or Raffles. It's really understanding the product, understanding whether you want the hotel guests into your piece, what restrictions you can put on that housing. And that's where the lawyers in the local jurisdictions are also really important, because there will be residential issues. It's all very well thinking you can put certain restrictions on the residences that will be for the benefit of all and for the benefit of the hotel. But if under local law, those can't be imposed or are incredibly difficult to enforce, then you might need to think again structurally how you separate the parts of the project.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Felicity. Jeff, let's move on to ROI from a developer's point of view. What are the advantages to them financially of taking on a branded residence project as opposed to just building some very nice apartments and selling them individually? You know, what are the kind of what are the main benefits? How would you sell it to them?
Yeah, there's a number of benefits, clearly. I'd love to just circle back to a point that Tia made, and I'll certainly come back to this because obviously it's a very important one. But I think it's fundamentally correct that there's a lot of reasons why purchasers acquire branded residences, and certainly in the ultra luxury space, we're more likely to see owner occupiers in that space. And I think for our developers and for the owners, the notion of a brand like Sofitel or Raffles, if a brand can be entrusted to safeguard an asset like Raffles Singapore, then it's clearly a great choice for Raffles Boston Back Bay, which will launch later this year. And it's that confidence of a luxury brand in that space that potentially covers generations. At the other end of the spectrum, and we do build, to be clear, we do have solutions in the fractional private residence club space, particularly under the Fairmont brand. For over 2 decades, we've been developing private residence clubs under Fairmont Heritage Place. And increasingly in the sale and leaseback or the strata hotel space, where we have a number of brands that are participating there. It is very interesting because what Tia spoke of in terms of Dubai, and I spent a number of years working in Dubai, and we also see a lot of this in Asia. There are certainly developers and there are certainly buyers who are prioritizing only investment or largely investment. And you'll see that personal use dimension of a mandatory rental program get scaled back from 45 days to 28 days to 14 to even 7, just as Tia described. I think that's important, but I also think it's quite important, I think, both for developers and operators to take a little bit of a step back from that and think about the product. And what we always like to remind ourselves when we're looking at a strata hotel or a mandatory rental program or a sale and leaseback is at the end of the day, any residential purchase really begins with an emotional tug on the heartstrings. You've got to be able to look at it and at least visualize it as a second home for part of the time, whether that's a week, whether that's 2 weeks, et cetera. And failing being able to look at it as a second home, then the ownership benefits and the global privileges that come with the purchase better bring a lot of privilege and exclusivity, because if it doesn't have that sort of emotional pull, once you get to the logic, if it's all about functional logic and if it's all about investment, it just becomes a more difficult sale, because if it's purely investment, and the competitive landscape isn't other second homes, it isn't other private residence clubs, it isn't other branded residences, it's a whole landscape of investment products, from mutual funds to REITs to individual equities, et cetera. And while mandatory rental programs and sale and leasebacks will in some instances stack up, and they'll deliver exactly the sorts of returns that buyers in certain markets are looking for, there's no question that those that are, first and foremost, a second home, even if only a couple of weeks a year, where the purchase is rationalized by the fact that when I'm not using it for that 2 or 3 weeks of the year, a trusted operator is looking after it, generating revenue for me such that I can, maintain the overheads attached with the investment. That's really where those products And that's often why we see the successful ones in resorts more so than we see them in urban destinations. The urban destinations are much more likely to be home to the lifestyle branded residents, the ultra luxury branded residences, and so on. So to segue back to the question, in terms of ROI, I think the first point we'd make there is when we consider branded residences, we're really comparing them against independently developed schemes of a similar location and a similar spec. So we've got to enable sort of an apples to apples comparison. So the benefit from the brand perspective really starts sort of in Felicity's area of expertise. It starts when you're working with the right operator that's been doing these type of projects for a couple of decades. It does have to be structured properly. The governing documents have to be right. The product needs to win, certainly from a developer perspective, and it's got to drive premiums and drive sales absorption and do all those things. But to be successful, it's also fundamentally, it needs to work for the consumer. And a lot of these conditions, covenants, and restrictions that we talk about, those aren't necessarily opposed to the interest of the consumer. They enable the consumer to look at a product and say, okay, this is how it's going to be operated. This is how it's going to be governed. This is how it's going to be structured. I can buy into that scheme with confidence. And Felicity is absolutely right. If you don't do that properly, then, or if it can't be done, if some of the clauses and restrictions aren't enforceable under local law, then fundamentally what you've got to do is make sure that last line of defense is that if key conditions aren't adhered to, that ultimately the hotel investor and the operator have the ability to withdraw benefits, privilege, access to private facilities. But I think the benefit for the developer starts with the experience that when you take the same brand and you apply it across both asset classes, when you physically integrate a luxury hotel and a luxury residences, and when you agree to provide services to those residences, there's a lot of things you need to get right from a legal perspective, from an operating perspective, and so on. And like the capable consultants that you need for any successful project, you fundamentally need an operator if you're going to build one of these that has been through it. And there are a number of obviously very experienced groups. In our case, we've been doing it for a couple of decades. We operate 40 of these. We've got another 80 under development. So we've been doing it for a while. I think the second piece is really on the marketing and the sales side. When you're licensing an internationally recognized brand with real cachet, regardless of the segment in, obviously it lends efficiency. It's not as difficult to acquire attention, to attract eyeballs, to get momentum in the marketplace. When you brand a luxury residence, oftentimes there are less headwinds in terms of leveraging media relations as a channel to support that project. And for one of our new developments, the Owo Residences by Raffles in London, many of you probably saw the coverage in the Financial Times over the weekend. That's the sort of attraction and momentum that projects like this are able to capture. Beyond that, obviously, from a development aspect and an operations aspect, there's all sorts of synergies for the developer. Effectively what you're doing is you're integrating two assets under a single management team. So there's shared services, shared savings. There's portions of the executive team of a hotel that can be potentially cross-charged to the homeowners association. There are obviously facilities and infrastructure that are being saved and so on. And then the biggest ticket item is probably the brand premium. And the brand premium is really this notion that when you license a brand like Fairmont or Sofitel or SLS or Mondrian, when you license a brand like that, you should be able to expect that brand to generate a premium in terms of achieved sales. And well, there are experts who are better at probably explaining the analysis of that, groups like Savills, who will shortly unveil their branded residential study for 2020, which always includes an update in terms of brand premium. Effectively, the concept is that the brand, on an apples to apples basis again, helps the developer achieve a pricing premium for the branded real estate product that compares to a independently branded scheme that is developed to a comparable spec and to a comparable location. So Savills, when they did their study last year, they found the average premium to be 35%. It was like Knight Frank have identified premiums in the 30% range, and WAT and other groups, as you touched on earlier, George, have taken looks at that. But obviously that brand premium and the operating efficiencies and the development efficiencies are critically important to all developers who are either contemplating or developing a branded residential project like this.
Do any of those studies include info on what the premium might be for resale value?
Yeah, I think the resale, that's probably a better question for the Savills and the JLLs and the Knight Franks of the world. But anecdotally, we've seen some, very, very strong evidence. For instance, we have a Fairmont residential project in Vancouver that was launched opened in 2010, the Pacific Rim property with some very, very stunning residences. Now that project was sold out prior to 2010, and in 2013 or 2014, that property set the record for both the most expensive apartment ever sold in Canada, but also the highest achieved price per real estate of any apartment ever sold there. And I think that's a bit of a testament. It's publicly available information. You can the sale and the transaction. But I think that's a testament, whether you're talking about our brands or that are in the lifestyle space or the luxury space. Again, if it's a brand that can be entrusted to safeguard an iconic hotel asset, it's going to do a wonderful job, and it's backed by the same caliber of management teams, not only of helping the development partner capture that initial premium, but safeguarding that asset for the purchaser, so that premium and the value that's created for the developer also generates value through resales and preserves the capital value for the purchaser for years to come.
Thanks, Jeff.
I'm happy to offer a little bit of a sort of addition on that, if you like. We've done quite a lot of work on those returns and those numbers that it involves, and Jeff is absolutely right. So I think we've concluded somewhere around 25 to 30% premium that you get on the sales price so that's for the initial developer who is actually doing it. So that's obviously the return that they are looking at, the sort of interesting piece for them. So there's definitely value in the brands at that time. And then when you look at it for the individual owners, the investment value that you might get on an annual basis usually is not that high. So you get to about 2 to 3% on average globally. There are exceptions, but there are also those where you don't even cover the costs. But then where it gets interesting, it's the underlying asset value. So in many of these cases, when you look at especially the luxury product, it's not just the branding, but usually these are also places where you've got the best site, great developer. It's just a package of everything coming together. So very often you end up seeing sort of underlying asset values going up 50%, even 100% over first couple of years. So there is, I think, the investment piece, that value on that for the investor, it's more focused on the underlying asset value.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And what I also think is that, that distinction you make between capital value and sort of recurring rental returns on an annual basis, I think that's another great example of understanding who the target market is at the beginning and picking the right brand and the right scheme and the right design. One of the things we have seen are schemes that, are really designed for an owner-occupier, and therefore, as you can imagine, in terms of volumetrics, area plans, very, very generous in terms of area allocations. That can be a wonderful home to make your private residence, your second home, or as you touched on earlier, third, fourth, fifth home. It can be wonderful in terms of capital value, but it's not necessarily optimal in terms of rental return. And so it really is important, as you say, to identify who the buyer is and then select the brand and build for that buyer. If you're really after is ROI in terms of recurring rental return, that probably drives you in a different direction than if you're an owner-occupier who's looking for an iconic address at the very top of the market, for either capital preservation or exclusively for personal enjoyment.
Taya, we saw a slide earlier that said that 86% of branded residence projects come with a hospitality brand attached, but we have seen fashion brands, we've seen car brands, and so on, also used in branded residences. What are the pros and cons of using a non-hospitality brand for your project?
Was that a question for me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I think the main thing, the short answer on that is kind of going back to what Jeff was saying earlier. So it's the whole experience that a hotel operator would bring to you. So there is a lot to be said about, it's not just the design and all the rest of it. It is also how you're going to manage the whole thing and how you're going to set it up. And that is crucially important. So it's true that because these returns have been seemingly quite attractive, you have seen a lot of brands which are not really in the hospitality space that have started sort of, let's get involved in this and let's have a sort of a share of the pie as well. And some of them have worked out. So you can look at the, again, sorry about the Dubai example, but the Armani in Dubai was a very successful example of fashion brands going into it. And then after that, you had other fashion brands who followed the scheme, and it hasn't been so successful. So I think what you see in a lot of these cases is also the fashion brands have made a realization that there is value then in partnering with the hotel operator. So a lot of them, they have been seeking to get on board with one of the big operators so that they can then lend the expertise in terms of the operations and management. And then they can, if you like, bring the value from having a brand established in a different arena.
Great, thank you.
George, I just wanted to add that sure. Whilst we see these glamorous products, you don't always see the brand committed to the product for the lifetime that the investor would expect to have that asset. And my other main concern is the transparency in the figures. The owner will need to, when they get their return, they will need to see what is being taken out, what goes to the various brand charges, and quite frankly, sometimes hotel owners don't have enough transparency, let alone the owners of the branded residences. So I think if that can be worked in when you're putting your initial pack together, it's a difficult one and it's semi-controversial, but I do think it's important.
Thanks, Felicity. We've spoken a lot about the luxury and ultra luxury end of the market, but we've had a couple of questions in from people who are watching in, and a couple actually along a similar theme. So Paul McSherry from Leisure Property Services said, I'd be interested in the panel's views on the upper and upscale markets for branded residences. From my clients and market experience, this appears to be a significant opportunity, meeting markets that are not defined by ultra or even high net worth individuals. And then Valentina Luque has said, branded residences have always been associated with upscale brands. Is there also a market for mid-scale brands in residential projects? Jeff, do you want to kick off with that one?
Yeah, happy to, George. Well, thanks, Luca, and thanks, Paul. I think those are both excellent questions. And I would argue that until about 5 years ago, other than the needs of luxe and ultra luxe buyers, and oftentimes in prime city centers and in very high-end resorts, the needs of many other potential residential purchasers were just overlooked. Now, an awful lot's changed in the last 5 years, and so there's very clearly a premium or an upper upscale opportunity. There are, not only Accor, there are a number of developers and operators capitalizing on that. But to provide some examples, we have a very prime located tower in Singapore with our partner EL Development that's being developed under the Pullman brand as a standalone. We've had tremendous success with the Movenpick brand across Asia. Brands like Swiss Hotel. Swiss Hotel's had exposure to the branded residential space now for 8-9 years. It's because we have a tremendous flagship property or reference point for the brand in Istanbul. Not surprisingly, it's been very successful in markets like Bodrum and it has a foothold elsewhere in Europe as well. So we're seeing a lot of activity there. I think you could make the very same point with respect to lifestyle. There's so much that can be achieved with lifestyle brands, and that's not only, I mean, we've got brands like So, which are, and SLS, which are clearly luxury lifestyle brands. And that is a big part of the story. But we also have brands like Hyde in the premium or the upscale segment. And one of the things that we will absolutely be doing in 2021 is introducing a branded residence concept in the mid-scale segment. If you look at our brand matrix, you can probably anticipate what we're thinking there. But we see it as a tremendous opportunity. We signed our first Novotel residences in the mid-scale segment, incidentally, in Mecca in 2019. So I think it really is a case of the fact that, you know, there are branded solutions up and down the segments. It's really a case of understanding what those buyers are and not replicating what you might do in ultra luxury and luxury in the mid-scale and the premium segments. Those brands are going to deliver on a slightly different set of needs, but there's a great opportunity there, and we're actually 5-6 years into it now.
If I can add on that, I totally agree with Jeff on it, and we have seen it with them, for example, Avani from Minor. They have been kind of operating in this space for some time, and I think we're going to see more and more brands that are bringing maybe more in the order of, we've gone from luxury to upscale and then further down to mid-scale. And I think that's the sort of format it might follow, adding to the lifestyle element work very well. And there's a couple of key trends at the moment, which I see as accelerating this process, which leads to COVID. We did really well. We did 50 minutes without a word COVID. So that must be a record of the webinars in recent times, but it has to come out. There is the COVID impact. And I think there is two things where this will be really relevant for branded residencies. So the first one is that there's a lot more emphasis now on our homes. So everyone has been spending more time at home. Everyone is making more efforts with their homes. They want to live nicely because you're spending more time there. And in many cases, home also means now office. So you have home offices. People are working from their homes in different parts of the world. And there is a certain flexibility and freedom that has come with this. So I think the reason you're going to have the more mid to upscale branded residencies growing in the world is that you have more buyers who will have the freedom moving forward to be conducting their work from different parts of the world. So for lifestyle reasons, they might want to be based somewhere nice and warm for the winter months, and then maybe come back to Europe for the summer or something else. And now with the whole home office and everything else, that facilitates this type of a movement for a wider audience of demographics. So I think that's going to be a key trend moving forward, this expansion to the mid-scale and upscale.
Well, let's pick up on specific geographical locations. And we've had a question from Darren Blanchard at PKF. Does the panel feel that the principal opportunities for branded residences are in mature markets such as Western Europe, or are they equally as attractive in emerging markets, for example, in Eastern Europe? What do they see as the barriers to the growth of branded residences in markets such as Poland, Turkey, and Russia? Would you like to start with that, Tia?
Yeah, so I'd actually flip it the other way around. I think where branded residencies have been really successful is actually often the emerging markets. So if you exclude the US, Canada, where it all kind of started from, after that, where branded residencies really did well was in Asia, was Middle East, some parts of Africa. Russia has actually been phenomenally successful. So if you look at, again, this is very luxury, high end, but these branded residencies have done really well. So I think as long as you're in a market where you have a certain demographic that is enough affluent to be able to have this type of residencies, I think you will do fine. So I think it's actually Europe, and in particular the sort of more established markets in Europe, key gateway cities, we're a little bit lacking on branded residencies. And part of that is because there simply hasn't been the sites available for that. I think that might change also because there's probably going to be less retail space, less commercial space, office space in city centers. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see some of those being converted into branded residencies in the key gateway cities in Europe in the future. But I think as a principle, general point, I think emerging markets can do extremely well with branded residencies. There's one but, and the but is that they have to have sufficient legal network or legal system in place that they can create the framework how to run this type of establishment, and that has not always been the case. So for example, in Indian Ocean, a lot of the countries, they've had to create a framework for that. It didn't yet exist.
Jeff, moving on from that but related, we've got a question here from Jeremy Wells who asks if branded residences can work well in secondary and tertiary markets, what challenges do properties in these markets face?
Yep, I think the short answer is that they can, but I think it's also important in those secondary markets is to just understand where that market is in its evolution. Has it, for instance, if it's an apartment scheme that's being contemplated, has the apartment market really evolved to the point where there's a genuine luxury or ultra luxury segment? You know, in some of those markets, what we see is that, you know, there may very well be a number of very affluent purchasers, but those affluent purchasers might be much more comfortable, you know, depending on the region, living in a villa, living in a landed house, etc. It may simply be a market where density or other reasons, cultural, etc., hasn't generated a significant and vibrant ultra luxury or luxury apartment market. And so it's very important, obviously, in those markets to match the brand and match the product with the needs. But, you know, we absolutely see in those secondary markets, in those tertiary markets, opportunities for product, but we've got to get the brand right. I think the point as well with respect to emerging markets or less mature markets is very important. Generally, what we've seen, you know, we'll see markets where there'll be a sort of a resistance or a delay in the concept being introduced. Often what we see in those markets is when it is introduced, a tremendous first mover advantage. And we'll often see sort of blowout results with the first project in a region, the first project in a continent, the first project nationally. And then what you generally see is a lot of activity after that. So, you know, the interesting thing, you know, is that for a number of years, for instance, Russia was touched on earlier, that's an interesting example. There were a lot of projects that got close to being branded and launched, but it just didn't happen. And we were finally able, with our partner Vesper in Moscow, to introduce last year the first Fairmont residences and the first branded scheme there. So it has been introduced. You know, a similar example would be South America. Historically, there haven't been a lot of branded residential schemes in South America, but we're now seeing a number of companies, including our own, make tremendous inroads. I think in our instance, you know, it's the strength of a lot of our, you know, brands like SLS and Hyde in Miami. Miami's an important reference point for a lot of South America that gives us traction and so on. But again, it's often about getting that first project across the line. But I think, you know, Felicity's comment about, again, structuring it and getting it right is again really, really important. The one thing we've seen though is even markets that are very, very difficult, where a lot of what we might expect a property law to make the scheme work, even markets like China, where a lot of the things that we might have done in markets that we're in before, we had to recreate and re-envision and adapt solutions to a very different sort of legal environment. We've been able to do that. And you now see branded residential projects in China that have been operating for 10 years. And so, you know, with the right legal advisors, with the right consultants, with the right operator, we've yet to see a market where we can't successfully do it. But you do need to match the brand to the market and the dynamics of the market, certainly.
And a lot of it will come down to who's going to buy the product. It's understanding your market and understanding whether it's going to be the local market that's going to buy it, whether it's the Middle East, the Far East, what the nature of the buyers for the product. And that also applies if you're looking at secondary and tertiary markets as much as any other region. It's where you're going to make your sales and as much as getting the legal structure right.
Yeah, yeah. Taya, I've seen you're so efficient, you're answering questions in the chat before you put them here, but let's just go over this one, and it'll have to be the last one because we're running out of time, unfortunately. But Liliana Lilaka from Knight Frank has asked, is there an optimal number of residences or a minimum number that brands would require?
Yeah, so basically this comes down to where does this residence sit in the scheme of the mixed use development or the wider development. So if you are looking at a, let's say, a luxury property, you've got hotel component and then you add some residencies to that, then you are literally just looking at addition. So what we found with most operators is that 10 plus they happy with. If it's less than 10, it's not worth the hassle, but you are not necessarily looking to 50 key hotel and 50 residencies. You might be looking at maybe 50 key of hotel, 10, 15, 20 residencies. When you're looking at, let's say, more a mixed use development where it's a either standalone branded residence, or let's say a key city location or something, I think you could be going into sort of 3 digits. So you might be looking at 100 plus to make it interesting to do, to sort of be worthwhile of the effort. So I think it really depends on the location, but more so, are these residencies standalone residencies? Are they part of a hotel? Then how big is the hotel and what's the positioning of the hotel?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get through the rest of the questions, but you have everybody's contacts in LinkedIn there. So if you want to connect with each other, please do and carry on the discussion afterwards. I just want to run through a couple of slides quickly before I sign off and thank our panelists for a great discussion. Next week's session is called Meet the Money. What are urban living real estate assets worth and where are the opportunities post COVID-19? That's next Wednesday at 2 o'clock BST. We've also recently launched 2 other webinar strands for from 2 of our dedicated B2B websites, Rockstars for the short-term rentals market with Paul, and Boutique Hotel Trailblazers with Eloise. You can see the timetables for those there. They're well worth a look. They're all very good. Just a quick reminder that this webinar is one of a series in the run-up to the Urban Living Festival, which is taking place in London on the 25th and 26th of November. There's currently a big discount on tickets, so we want to see as many of you there as possible. We've got a great collection of sponsors, media partners and exhibitors already confirmed, some of whom you can see here. If you're interested in getting involved, then please get in touch with my colleague Katie, whose details I believe are in the chat. Yep, there they are. So there are the next 3 webinars in this session. We've overrun by a couple of minutes, but I think it was worth it. So I'd just like to say a very big thank you to Felicity, to Taya, and to Jeff for a great session. Thanks to CommScope for sponsoring. And someone started a party already. Thanks, guys. Really enjoyed the chat and hope to see plenty of you in the session next week. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Felicity.
Bye-bye.